Check the mic and make sure it sounds
So
right.
welcome
boy.
everyone to the group chat brought to you by Overmark. I'm Darrell. Happy to be here today with Brian to be discussing a topic that is super important, which is how do we memorize content more easily? And I think this is a problem that a lot of students are struggling with, and we hope to be able to shed some light, if not to share some useful tips in terms of how we used to memorize content when we were students, and maybe even for Brian because he's still studying now. So hopefully he has a lot more tips to share. So maybe Brian, talk about why content is so important, especially for humanities.
Actually, I wouldn't say that memorizing content is the most important. I think that understanding content is the most important because understanding content is what gives you the ability to memorize it, right? So I always think of it like a chef cooking. I mean, obviously a chef would be memorizing every single step to making a dish like pasta or something like that. But he would understand why he puts the oil first, and why he puts the onion, the garlic, etc. And then everything from there on is just a reflection of the person's understanding, right? So I mean, I take the same approach towards studying. If I don't understand the topic, I won't be able to memorize effectively because to me, information flows with understanding. So first and foremost, content is the most important, or understanding is the content is the most important because it is what gives you the ability to memorize the content. I mean, we've all like seen people who don't understand the content try to memorize it. I've had like I've had friends who I've seen for O or A levels, right? They would laminate pieces of cheat sheets of chemical formulas and they will put it in the toilet while they shower. So I mean, I think it's really ineffective lah. I think it looks kind of crazy as well. They put the laminated cheat sheet next to their bathing materials or their soap, etc. And then they look and they try to memorize, which I think is absolutely crazy. But because they don't understand why certain chemical formulas the way they do, or they don't understand the subject at all, it doesn't really correlate to memorizing the content. Because at the end of the day, once they have taken the shower, they step out, they forget everything already. Content is important, secondly, because it streamlines the time you need to answer questions. So most of the time, students face the difficulty when they face the difficulty of time constraint. I mean, given enough time, anyone can write a decent essay about Hitler or Stalin, but not everyone can do so within the time constraint. So I think that content is what gives you the ability to have effective time management. When you know your content, answers flow easily, and when you read the question, you'll be able to quickly generate ideas for an answer. So all in all, the 2 points why content is the most important, or understanding content is the most important, is understanding content allows you to memorize. And second, by understanding and then memorizing the content, you are able to manage your time effectively during the examination.
Oh my God, I completely agree with that. I mean, I was trying to debate you a bit when asking you why is memorizing content important, but I completely agree. Like, if you're talking about purely memorizing content, right, it is so pointless because if you don't understand the content first, there's no meaning to that content and you don't even know how to apply it. Okay, I always give this analogy to all my students that I teach. Okay, so if you're memorizing content, just think of yourself as a hard disk with a limited space. So even if your hard disk is super big, say 2 terabytes, okay, maybe 10 terabytes, there's a limit to how much files you're eventually able to store. If you keep memorizing everything, at one point in time, you're going to overload and you're not able to store more. And that's when you start forgetting and stuff. And if you store too many files on your hard disk, it will eventually get corrupt and then it will spoil as well. And it's going to be a lot slower too. So there's a lot of cons towards just purely memorizing. However, if you add that layer of understanding, you think of yourself more as a software. You know, you upgrade your iOS, you upgrade your Windows from one version to another. Because when you understand, you're able to internalize, and through that, you don't have to memorize anymore. Because the moment you understand something is part of your knowledge sphere, and you're just connecting the dots with other parts of your content that you have memorized, and it makes things a lot easier. So are you the kind that you're trying to download content nonstop, or are you the kind that you're trying to upgrade your software? If you're working on upgrading your software, then you're doing it right. So the thing with memorizing is that you will be prone to forgetting. And this is very normal, especially in the exam setting. Everybody say, oh, I choke, like I forget this, I forget that. It's only natural because if you memorize, you're going to forget. That is a natural cycle. You probably can't remember what you ate like 2 months ago for lunch, right? Because that's something you commit to memory. And your memory, trust me, is not flawless. It has a lot of flaws. So, however, when you understand how a concept works, for example, once you learn how to cycle a bicycle, you understand how the balancing works, your body get the idea of it, you won't be able to unlearn it. You will know it for life. That goes the same for understanding, which is why sometimes some students, after they get a certain concept, is like the mind equals blown because they suddenly see the whole picture and there's nothing to memorize. I give a common example. When we're talking about exo and endothermic reactions in chemistry, a lot of students approach it by memorizing, okay, these are exothermic reactions. For example, photosynthesis, electrolysis, these are endothermic reactions, but they never bothered to understand the why. And that's when they start memorizing, and sometimes they forget. It's normal. But if you take a deeper dive and you look at the content itself, there's a reason why they're either exo or endo, dependent on whether they are taking in energy into the system or giving out energy. So these are all things you need to spend time to understand. And once you understand, there's a lot lesser to memorize. Of course, if we are talking about things like facts, for example, like which year World War II started, all of this, yes, there is no choice in terms of memorizing, but there are certain techniques which you can make things a lot easier. And I think that's what we want to allude to next in terms of where we are going with for our podcast. So I hope we establish faults with purely memorizing and the importance of understanding. Now, what are some difficulties that students tend to face when they memorize is that when they try to memorize everything. And when we say that, it means that you think that your memory is very good and then you try to digest and download everything and regurgitate. It works only to a certain extent and it's not very highly replicable. And if you take a lot of subjects and content-heavy subjects, that's when you'll die. For example, I know that certain O-level day is geography plus bio. And that in itself is a killer day because there's so much, it's a very content-heavy sort of day. Because if you take geog, there's a ton of content, and bio, there's also a ton of content. So instead of looking at it from this perspective, if you are able to downsize what you have to memorize, you have a much easier time when we come to that. Now, getting enough on the importance of understanding over memorizing, let's next talk about some memorizing tips that you can use if you really have no choice and have to memorize.
Okay, for memorizing tips. Okay, so for memorizing tips, right, the same thing, it starts from understanding content. How to understand content is to, for every chapter, create questions. And the questions that you create, they must be unique to yourself. So just find the 3 important questions that you think are most pertinent to the topic. And then you answer them using the exam structure format in which you would normally answer a question like that. And then just keep on writing them. I always find that it's better to write than to type because I always feel like it's something about muscle memory. Maybe it's just vintage or something like that. I will just keep writing out important dates and times for history and highlight them and rewrite. So, right, I will write maybe pertaining to outbreak of World War II. I would say, what were the important reasons why World War II broke out? And then I'll write it out. Hitler's aggression. I'll write it out in PEL format. And then when I'm done, I will look back and I'll highlight the important parts. And then I'll point an arrow out and I'll write it again. So when I'm revising or looking back at my notes, I see an important date or name or policy which I highlighted and arrowed out, and everything that I've done for that particular question will quickly rush back to me. So it's quite automatic. It's like step and it will immediately come back. And for understanding content, I think it's useful to do all this revision in advance, right? A lot of students think that it is possible to leave it at the very last week before I start studying, but it's not possible. I think you will need at least a month, or for most students, 1.5 to 2 months to start before you are able to understand everything truly for the subject. For me, what helps is rewriting all the notes. Because I know a lot of times, right, when you look at the school notes, you just look at it and you read and you don't really internalize everything. You're just flipping through paper. It's like reading newspaper. You don't understand everything, you just read. It looks like words on paper, so it must be correct. So I think the most important thing is to try not to blindly copy and try to recall actively as you are writing out the notes. And only use the notes as reference when you need to, when you're doing your own notes. So yeah, I think that's pretty much how I think is the best way to go about understanding content.
Okay, for myself, I have a couple more that I hope to share. So at least for history and for SS, something that I did when I was studying was to think of it more of a story rather than memorizing individual content points. So in history, it's very interesting because you definitely have a timeline, you have people involved, you also have the location, and you definitely have a what, which is the issue. And the how is in terms of the how it resolved or how it led to the next issue. So instead of looking at it as very independent, I try to think of it more as like a storyline whereby we have different characters, and then like this is the script on what's happening and all the different key events and milestones that occurred. So I thought that gave me a better overview on how things work. For example, I categorized Hitler as a very charismatic, he's very cunning. So under cunning, what were some of the moves that he did and how it fell into the different timeline? Because when you take a step back and you zoom up, actually history is always intertwined. For example, Great Depression is related to Hitler's rise and the Nazi Party rise, you see. So everything has a sort of like a cause and effect sort of relationship, or a root cause to why the Nazi is so nationalist, because they suffered from League of Nations and their harsh repayments and stuff like that. So everything is interrelated. And when you take a step back and you see that bigger picture and the whole story, then the whole reason why World War I, World War II, and the Cold War started, all of it would make sense. So it's all about the people, about the event, as well as the time. So if history, there's any tips for content, I think that's one way to look at it. So how I used to teach my students for history is that I have this timeline. So I tell them, okay, so the timeline we're looking at is 1930 to 1945. And what are the key events and who are the key players? So when you do that, I think it gives you a bit more clarity. Okay, for science, because I'm teaching science, one effective way for you to study your content is to actually mind map. So mind map is a very, very good way for you to see relationships as well as the linkages. One super important chapter, which most of you are learning now, is organic chem. Organic chem, you have to do mind map because you don't study your homologous series independently. You need to see the relation between how alkene turn into alcohol, or how cracking can produce alkene and alkane, or esterification. So there's a lot to it, and you need to see the relationship early on for you to be able to master the chapter. So while this is content itself, it can be made a lot easier. If you want to download my mind map of organic chem, you can simply find it on the website or the Telegram channel. So go and use that to your advantage. Some other ways we memorize that I think are effective are like acronyms. I'm sure when you're studying your metal reactivity series, your school will teach you like, what, please stop calling me what, like, you know, there's something for you out there to memorize. So if there are things that you have no choice, but you need to commit it to memory, find an easier way around it rather than just purely memorizing. There needs to be a pattern, or there needs to be an acronym for you to be able to easily recall that content, especially in an exam. So acronyms is a very good start for you to memorizing. Okay, so some ways you can make the acronyms a bit more exciting. For example, what are your magnetic materials? So there's nickel, iron, cobalt, and steel. So it's NICS, NICS, right? So what I tell my female students is, okay, how do you remember your magnetic materials? Who is very attractive? Think of a very handsome Nicholas in your life. I don't know whether Nicholases are handsome, but let's just assume that Nicholas is super handsome and you're attracted to him. So that is like your magnetic material. Then for my male students, I tell them, okay, girls, which girls are you attracted to? Girls from St. Nick's, right? So Nick's. So these are all ways you can make a story, and then it becomes a lot easier to memorize things because you're no longer just like thinking of it in a very mundane manner, but you're inserting things that you can relate to, and the storytelling really makes it a bit more digestible. And when you really need to recall it, it becomes a lot easier too. And lastly, the last thing I want to highlight is if you really need to memorize content, sometimes making your own notes has its benefits, because when you're using your school notes or the textbook, the information is everywhere. You want to organize it in a way whereby it is very concise. When you take a look at it, everything you need is there. And when you design your own notes, there's also the benefit of you having been the one designing it, you know where everything is. So it becomes a lot more proficient. And in the exam, when you really need to recall certain things, you can always go back to your muscle memory when you're doing the notes. Of course, there are downsides towards creating your own notes, which is very time consuming. And sometimes you don't even know whether your notes are accurate or not, which is why for us, we design the curated notes. But if you're on the path of like you like to design your own notes, I think go ahead with it, but always pay attention that you should probably get either your teacher or somebody else to help you QC your notes to see if it's accurate. You don't want to be memorizing the wrong stuff. Okay, so those are all on memorizing tips. other than that, what are some other ways we could memorize content more easily? So I just wanted to share a few of my own personal experience that I use that I found to be effective. So one of it was for history was to watch videos. I thought that videos that were entertaining was super easy for me to digest boring content. Other than that, something that I saw a lot of my friends do is to use cue cards. So instead of looking at pointers on a piece of paper, like Brian said, like reading newspaper like that, instead, when you use cue cards, it becomes a lot easier. And also something that I like to do is I test myself after I memorize. So maybe after 1 hour after dinner, I'll go and check whether I'm still able to answer those questions and the stuff that I memorized. So Brian, do you have anything else to add on that point?
I think actually I don't have any more for memorization, but I can add on a few optimal revision strategies, right? So I think the most important is active recall. So active recall is where you test yourself after each chapter. So if you're still not sure after you test yourself after reading each chapter, you go back and then you read again, and then you test yourself. So until you're able to test yourself effectively and answer correctly, then you can be said to have fully understood the topic, right? And I think the next thing for revision strategies is to not fall into the trap of ineffective study blocks. I know many students, right, they like to sit at Starbucks for 8 to 12 hours a day, and they think that it's really productive. But actually, the truth is, it's not productive because I have done it myself. I mean, I ended up at the National Library when I was studying for my examinations. I would sit there from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. And then I realized effectively I'm only doing 4 to 5 hours of work. What did I do with the rest of the time? You go eat with your friend, you buy a coffee, you watch YouTube, you start playing games. Actually, sitting down at a table is not an effective, for an extended period of time, it's not an effective way to study. It is important to actually create deadlines for yourself, even within the day. So use 45-minute intervals to make sure that you're really making use of the time. The deadlines create a sense of urgency, right? And then for each block of 45 minutes, you give yourself a 10-minute break. And then for each block of 45 minutes, you also create an agenda for each study block. So at the end of the agenda, right, you can take a short break, 10 to 15 minutes, and you can do whatever you want, and you don't have to feel guilty because you've fulfilled your agenda. For example, maybe for 45 minutes, I would give myself an agenda. The agenda will be, all right, study the reasons or memorize the reasons or understand the reasons why World War II broke out in the first place. That's something that is easily doable within 45 minutes if you have the resources, right? And when you're done, you can go to the toilet, you can walk around, or you can watch a YouTube video without feeling guilty because you have been productive for that 45 minutes. And then when you come back, you realize that when you split your time up into 45-minute intervals and you give yourself a task for each one of these intervals, you find yourself achieving a lot more in a single day.
Just going back to a point on your concentration span, if you are sitting there studying for more than, I say easily, more than 2 hours, half the time you're not being productive already. So if you take a look at more scientific research, what is the human's optimal attention span? In fact, I think with TikTok nowadays, attention spans are getting a lot shorter. It's just a natural of the number of stimulus. But if you're studying more than 2 hours, it's ineffective. In fact, the optimal time you should be revising or doing anything is 45 minutes for studying, because that is the best time for you to zero in and to absorb everything effectively. Then you're supposed to take a break. Taking breaks are so underrated. Now, the thing about feeling productive and actually being productive is very different. Let's say I tell you that you only have 2 hours to study a day, right? And you really make the best out of those 2 hours. It's so much more important than you sitting there doing nothing for, not say doing nothing, but being very ineffective for 8 hours. So it's just a matter of perspective. It's not about the volume here, or it's not about the time spent. It's about the time you actually spend learning and committing things to memory. That makes a huge difference. Another way you can check whether you memorize your content well, right, is I always like to use this technique. Explain to my mother. So what I mean is that if I'm able to explain World War II and how it started to my mom in an easy and understandable way, then I succeeded, because that means I really know my content. Because if you're thinking about things that are like very complicated ways of looking at things, then suddenly everything gets very complicated and you're not too sure whether you know your content or not. In fact, at O level, what they're looking for is not so much like content and regurgitation. A lot of times the key differentiating factor, even if you know your content, it falls in the explanation portions of it. So especially like say history and SS, yes, you need examples and those are things you have to memorize. But if you don't explain your example, there's actually no point to that content. So you can think of content as supplementary blocks to your main skill sets which are tested in these different subjects. For science content, I truly believe, right, that there's no content that needs to be fully memorized. Even for QA, which is seemingly a heavy memorization sort of topic, there's actually ways you can break it down in terms of, for example, your cations, you look at it, those that dissolve in excess are amphoteric. Or maybe you look at your anions, they're actually about precipitation of insoluble salts. So actually a lot of things can be explained. It's just a matter of whether you put in the time and effort to find those answers. So while content seems intimidating, it's a matter of how you make things a lot easier. I hope for this episode, we have shared useful memorizing tips. Now, moving on to my favorite portion of the podcast, which is the dilemma of the week. Now, Brian, how or when should a student start memorizing their content? So in terms of time frame, is 1 week before, 1 month, 3 months, 1 year ahead? So what is your advice?
I mean, if you're listening to this podcast now, right, you should actually start understanding the content right now. So the best time to start is months before the exam. I mean, as I mentioned in the previous podcast, right, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. Sprinting through the content is not something that is feasible for every single person. Not many people can do it. I know some people that manage to pull a miracle in their A-levels and score perfect marks after scoring like terrible marks in the prelims. But that's just something that's not available to every single person. For the rest of us, the normal people, right, it will be more effective to split your studying and to have a paced but focused study timetable leading up to the O-levels. But for those of you who are listening to this podcast at the very last minute and panicking, don't worry. The best advice I can give for last minute muggers, right, is to prepare your necessary resources earlier, right? So that when it comes to mugging season, maybe a month before your exam, you have everything laid out. And if I were to give a definite timeline, right, I would say that for history and SS, 2.5 months is where you need to start your studying already. So 2.5 months prior to the examination is where you should have your school activity start standing down, and you should just be studying already, right? And still have a lot of time to do your practice papers later on. So you don't end up stretching yourself too thin during this examination period, and you can maybe end up only having to study at most 6 to 8 hours a day, which would be optimal.
Okay, I think what Brian said makes complete sense. The question is when should you start memorizing is as early as possible. But I know that most people will not do that, right? I myself, I did not do that too. So what is realistic? If you're starting the day before, you're just screwed. Let's just admit it. Okay. If that's your plan, like you're listening to this podcast and your exam is tomorrow, there's nobody that can help you. Burning the midnight oil is even worse because next day you'll forget everything. Okay. Now, so if you're looking at a very last minute sort of situation, how much time do you need to give yourself? I'll say minimally, at least give yourself 2 weeks. Best case scenario, a month. Because while I understand that, of course, it would be great to memorize as much content as possible and understand this content early on, I also acknowledge that, maybe this is not your only subject. There are multiple subjects that you're dealing with, and maybe you need to spend more time on some of the other subjects. Completely understandable, dependent on your situation and your strategy for your national exam. But you cannot do a last minute revision. And I want to warn against those that you try to cram everything in the 2 to 3 days before your exam. The truth is, whatever you study the day before or like the night before, right, the next day in the exam, you will not remember it. So that is the truth, because that's just how your mind works. It needs time to organize that information and to really synthesize it such that you're able to bring it out during the exam. So something that I will encourage you to do now is that if you have your prelims upcoming, that means you still haven't done your prelims yet. Why not use that as a mock exam itself and prepare for it as if how you prepare for your O-levels, and you memorize it and you look at the content that you need to digest, because that will give you a very good first trial run. Then come the actual exam at O-level, you can then run it through again, and that's when you get your content a lot more grounded. So there is no secret to this. If we're talking about purely about memorization of content, you need to find ways to make it work. Even though I feel like my memory sometimes quite good, try not to invest too much of your confidence in photographic memory. What do I mean by that? You sit there, you stare at the paper for 10 minutes, then you think you can take a photo and then you can regurgitate everything. That doesn't work, trust me, okay? Because your brain is not wired that way. So when you're memorizing content, you need to find a know-how that works for you. Maybe it doesn't work for other people, but you need to find a way that works for you. So like I shared earlier, there's a certain thing that you have to commit to hard memory, you have to find a way to make it more interesting or something that you can recall, or telling yourself a story that works. So there's a lot of ways you can do it. You just have to be creative about it, and then you have to stick with that. And then suddenly you will find that actually memorizing is more of a game rather than like a hardcore task that you need to commit yourself to. So once you are able to find that creative way of memorizing things, everything gets a lot easier, right? So it's about discovering more about yourself as a person. Are you the kind that, like colors and beautiful notes appeal to you? Then maybe you should be the kind that are making your own notes. Or if you're the kind that you need a more creative way of memorizing things, then maybe you want to create some stories towards memorizing a certain content and stuff. And for history, if you're the kind that you need to look at content more interestingly, then you must find ways to either conjure up how you visualize Hitler, or you can look at videos. There are tons of ways. You just need to find what works for you. Okay, so I think with that, we have shared plenty about how to make memorizing content easier. And with that, we have come to the end of the group chat. If you're watching this on YouTube, do give us a like and smash the like button. And of course, if you want us to discuss another topic, do leave the topic and comment in the section below. I think we will be more than happy to talk about those topics. But Brian, once again, thank you for coming onto this podcast. And with that, we'll see you in the next podcast. Bye, everyone.
It sound right, boy.